and that's where your comments will be.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Welcome to another virtual author event with the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today we are delighted to welcome back two bright stars in the romance genre, Jenna Levine and Jamie Wesley. Jenna's new book is My Vampire Plus One, and Jamie has a book coming soon to bookstores and libraries near you, A Legend in the Baking. Before we begin, I'd like to let those tuning in know they're more than welcome to order copies from the Poison Pen. Just give us a call or go online and we'll be happy to connect you with these truly fabulously entertaining books. And I'd like to welcome Jamie and Jenna.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us. My first question to both of you, and we'll start with you, Jamie, is what can you tell us about Jamie before you became a published author? What was your origin story?
Oh, that's such a good question. Let's see, what was so my origin story really is I've always been a big reader. And English and language arts was always my best subject in school, but it honestly never occurred to me to write fiction. In high school, I did the school newspaper, and so when I went to college, I went with the assumption that I was going to go into journalism or public relations. And so I did work for an ad agency after I graduated from college. And then, like I said, I've always been a big reader. I've been reading romance since I was a little kid. And after grad school, I got an idea for a book. And I was like, well, you've been reading romance for 20 plus years at this point. Why don't we try it? So I did. I had no idea what I was doing, but I was bit by the bug and kind of been going ever since.
Jenna, what about you?
So, like Jamie, I've always been a reader. But I also I never envisioned a life where I would be writing novels. I took a dramatically different career path, which I'm still somewhat on, because a lot of voices, both in my head and in my family and society, hit home the idea that being a novelist, writing for your profession is really unstable and not something that can be relied upon to pay the bills. You can face a whole lot of rejection, all of which is true, to be clear. But I, really listened to those voices and pursued an entirely different career path. I went to law school. I'm still, for now, a practicing lawyer. But I always wrote. One of my earliest memories, and this dates me or ages me somewhat, is one of my earliest memories is writing Smurf fan fiction. That's what it would be called now, I think. In the early 80s, I don't think that was a term, on my parents' typewriter. And I just loved making up stories, and that's something that really stayed with me. I wrote for fun. I wrote fan fiction ultimately that went on the internet. And then in the pandemic, we had moved to a brand new place where for our careers, my husband and I we accepted the jobs, and then the pandemic hit and we moved, new place, knew nobody, like in this early summer of 2020. And I sort of had a reckoning. I was like, this is always something I've wanted to try. Why not? And I think the idea I had was really quite loony or kind of a little bit off the wall. And I think, and not very serious. And I, in hindsight, think that it might have been like right tone, right time, right moment. And everybody was looking for an escape. And that's sort of how my debut happened. So.
And your first book was My Accidental Vampire Roommate, is that correct?
That's functionally a summary of the book, yes. But My Roommate is a Vampire, the actual title. But I mean, that also is basically what the book is, so what you said.
Jamie, when did you decide you wanted to pursue writing? And if I remember correctly, your first book garnered you a rather prestigious award.
Well, no. Well, my first book is called Tell Me Something Good, and it was published in 2014. And it was actually a finalist in RWA's Golden Heart competition, which is a competition for unpublished writers. I didn't win it, but being a finalist is still was a
Yeah.
pretty big deal. So that was the moment I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'm not wasting my time. Okay. So with that book, after I finaled, I queried agents and got a lot of rejections. And honestly, it sucks getting rejections, but it just made me realize I was like, okay, yes, the premise of the book is good, but it's still the actual book needs work. So I just went back to work and I made the book better. And then I submitted it to Entangled and they bought it. So it was like the work I put in was good. So that was 2012. So I think I probably started that book in 2010 or 11.
Let's talk a little bit about the book that brought you here with us today. Jamie, for you, it's a book that's coming soon, A Legend in the Baking. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, so it's releasing November 19th, so a little over a month from today. It is the second in my Sugar Blitz series, and Sugar Blitz is the name of a cupcake shop. And the owners of the cupcake shop, there are three owners, and they happen to be professional football players. And A Legend of Baking is the second in the series, and it's obviously about one of the owners. He is the strong, silent type, which we love. And
I
until
love
one
August, by the way.
thank you, thank you. Until one day he's not so silent. Like he gets really angry, and he ends up taking it out on someone who kind of deserves it, but it's not exactly why he's angry. So he becomes like an internet sensation, much to his very much dismay. And it's the tropes used like is the love interest is his best friend's little sister. So, and they kind of have a history. So we explore that, but they don't get along, or they're very awkward around each other because of their history. So you kind of at some point you have to confront that history and to see a future. So that's kind of what happens in the book.
Jenna, your latest book is My Vampire Plus One. What do readers need to know about the book?
Much like my debut, the title sort of functions as a summary.
I love your titles.
Thank you. Yeah, my debut title, I told my editor, this is a placeholder title. And she's like, no, it's perfect. So so basically it like Jamie's, my book is the second in a series. It follows sort of the sidekick, slightly nemesis-ish. I think frenemy is probably the way to describe him, of the main character in the first book. And the female protagonist, Amelia, very successful accountant. She loves her career. She's in her mid-30s. Everything's going great, but her family keeps nagging her for still being single in that annoying way. Family can, there's one thing everything in your life's going great. There's one thing that's missing. They may harp on that. And so she gets a little tipsy one night and decides with her best friend that she's just going to find some guy, anyone, first man she happens to come across, to be her fake date at a family wedding. And she, at a coffee shop, she happens to run into a really strange person that she weirdly bumped into the night before. And she's like, fine, whatever, he'll do. And it turns out he has a secret. And I could tell you what that secret was, but I could also refer you to the title. And yeah.
For both of you, your books are the second, and we'll use the word series, that has a slightly different connotation in romance land than it does in other genres. But was writing the second book easier, or was the first easier? How does working with a world that you've built help or hinder you as an author? And we'll start with you, Jenna.
I started it thinking it would be way easier because I had this character in mind. I had the world set up. I'd actually been thinking about this book a little bit longer, but it turned out to be much more difficult for so many reasons, some of which were I was writing it before my first book even came out. like it was available for pre-order, but nobody really read it. And I really let that get into my head a lot. And second of all, the female main character in the second book, I actually related to a lot, like in a lot of different ways. But Reginald was a supporting character in the first book and was very much comic relief and not a very fleshed out character. And so, and sort of like somebody that it might be hard to imagine being a romantic lead. And so the second book, the hard part, separate and apart from getting out of my own head about writing a book before the first one had come out, was taking a character who I thought was an effective comic foil and making him be like a compelling, believable love interest. I'm happy with how it turned out, but so far that part of writing has been the most challenging thing I've done in my writing career so far.
Jamie, what about you? Was book two easier or harder?
See, every book is hard. So
Yeah,
it's not
I agree with
easier.
that.
I think, with the second book, like Jenna, the first book had come out. So you're introduced to August in the first book, and it's lovely, but it's also really hard to hear people say, "I'm really looking forward to August's story." It's great, but it's like, oh my God, that's so much pressure, and I want to get it right, and I want them, if they love the first book, I really want them to love the second book. And then also it's funny because when you're writing the first book, you're just writing it, da, 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 da. In the second book, you're like, oh, there are some details in the first book that I need to make sure continue on into the second book. Some dateline things, it's like, oh, they were 21 when this happened, or they were a teenager. It's like, okay, how long? So that was 12, 13 years ago. Let me make sure that is still lining up correctly in the second book. So, and also, even things like descriptions. What color is his eyes in this first book? Let me make sure it continues on. So it's little things like that that can trip you up.
For both of your series, you, for lack of a better word, will use hook. There's a hook to them. In your case, Jamie, it's baking and sports. And Jenna, yours is vampires, the undead. How did you come up with this particular way to anchor the series? We'll start with you, Jamie, because I don't think I'm revealing anything. You do a wonderful job with the baking part, but that's not your natural inclination.
No. And I'm like, anytime someone says it, I'm like, thank you. I have no idea what I'm talking about. No, I'm not a baker. I'm not a cook. But I'm a big, huge sports fan. So the sports is always the easy part for me. It's the fun part. It's the part I don't have to do any research. I just kind of already have that in my head because I've been a sports fan since I was a kid. With the baking, yes, there is research involved. Because even like I think I know what goes into baking a cook, like the ingredients, but let me Google that real quick just to make sure I know what I'm talking about. Googling how long it takes to bake a batch of cupcakes. Is it 20 minutes? Or will people like, no, Jamie, it takes an hour. It's just honestly, it's Googling things like that. As far as how I came up with it, when I first started thinking about this series, I knew I wanted to write about football players who are thinking about what's next after their football career ends, because football, a lot of players, they honestly don't have a long career. And so you do have to think about that. And so I started from there. And then one day I saw a Microsoft Surface commercial years ago, and it featured some football players who owned a cupcake shop. And I was like, that's such a great idea. I'm just going to go ahead and take that and marry that to the idea I'm already working on. And, it's turned out for the best for me because, I just literally, people ask me, what's your book about? I'm like, it's about football players who own a cupcake shop. And that immediately grabs their attention.
Jenna, what about you? Why vampires?
So I get this question a lot. And I really love this very silly TV show called What We Do in the Shadows. And I watched a lot of it during the pandemic, and I also love romance novels and had just finished reading Beth O'Leary's The Flat Share. And I often cope with like being really stressed out with humor. And I was like, what if vampires, but also Beth O'Leary's The Flat Share, but also the humor of what we do in the shadow, like that kind of off the wall bonkers thing. And so it really wasn't so much I mean, it was vampires, but it was much more, I was drawn to the humor in a particular inspiring show that happened to be about vampires. Um, that if I think about it also would have worked really well if they were just a strange family. Like them drinking blood is actually very secondary to like the wackiness that goes on that show. And I kind of think it's true in my novels as well. Like the blood drinking is very much off the page. It's not a bloody vampire series. And so I think, you know, that's sort of how I was drawn into it. More than like, I mean, and I loved Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I read Twilight and got a tremendous kick out of it and have loved a lot of vampire stories, but it was more just the themes and the humor sort of coming together, I guess, in a romance novel that really appealed to me.
One of the things you do in your both books, Jenna, that I love is you kind of add a epistolatory writing thread to the story. In the first book, it was letters. In the second, it was journaling. Was that something you wanted to do to just come in organically? They're hilarious. I mean,
Thank
they
you.
lead you to
Um,
really understand the characters so much.
I'm sorry?
You really understand the characters better after reading those little bullet journals or the letters. They
Thank
give you
you.
insight into them.
So some of that came from me just completely falling in love with Beth O'Leary's storytelling method in The Flat Share. I was like, I love, like, I really sort of fell in love with how they fell in love, and it was through these Post-it note exchanges. And I also really love playing around with point of view, characters' point of view. And I feel like I wanted to present, particularly in the first book, I wanted to give Frederick a very limited, like I wanted him to have a point of view, but I wanted it to be extremely limited. And I wanted what I did give him to be presented in sort of an unconventional way. And so, I mean, the epistolary parts of my books are actually, I'm thrilled that you enjoyed them because without question, particularly in my first book, my favorite parts to write because I just think playing around with what we see of the character's perspective is just so much fun.
Jamie, in your second book, your heroine is, we'll say, a social media genius in many ways. She knows how to work social media platforms. Is that something that you put in because it's something you yourself are fascinated by? What led you to make her such a pro at that?
Oh my goodness. So I'm not a social media pro. That takes like a lot of time and effort that I do not have. I admire people who are, but actually I got the idea to make her a social media manager because I used to watch a show called The Bold Type. And it was about three 20 somethings in New York who worked at a magazine. And one of the leads, one of the girls she's a social media manager for the magazine. So and I really liked her character. And I was like, oh, that's a good job to have for a heroine, especially one who's in her mid-20s. It's very today. And obviously I knew what had happened or what was going to happen with August. So marrying those two together made a lot of sense to me.
Let's talk a little bit about your writing process in general as authors. I think it's okay to say you both are juggling your writing careers with another career. So how does it work for you when you begin a project? Do you always know right up the front, this is what I want to do? Do you sit and wait for the muse to strike? How does writing a book, whether it's the first or the second or the third in a series, work? And we'll start with you, Jamie.
Well, with this book or series, I knew I sold it all at once. So I had, I knew I sold it the first book, obviously, but I had to have like paragraphs about books 2 and 3. So I always knew what the book was going to be, and I know what the third book is going to be about, generally speaking. But again, those are only paragraphs. So when you actually get to writing, you really have to expound on that little cute paragraph you wrote. So it's what I generally try to do is write not like a full-fledged synopsis where some authors, their synopses can be like 20 to 40 pages. Mine are usually around 5 pages, and it's basically just hitting the big points in the story, turning points, like what are their issues individually as a couple, internally and externally, how do they come together, what's tearing them apart. So it's just very basic, and then I just start writing, and it's fun with the little details that come, because I do want each character to have their own personality and their own quirks. So I don't generally think about those until I'm writing, and then it'll just come to me. Like in Legend, the female lead, she loves lemon meringue pie.
Yeah.
I had no about that just came to me as I'm writing, and was like, oh, okay, yeah, that sounds good. And then you figure out, then once you have that little detail, it's fun to kind of sprinkle it in elsewhere in the book.
Jenna, how do you approach your writing projects?
So similarly to Jamie, the first 2 books I sold together. And so I had a pretty clear idea of the main characters and their characteristics sort of from the outset. The second book, again, began as a couple of paragraphs like Jamie, and then it had to be a synopsis. And yeah, I do know of people that submit these like really lengthy synopses. Mine, again, was like kind of like yours, a few pages. The real challenge is, so I wrote these, I sold these 2 books, and then after my first book came out, I submitted my option. And my editor was like, well, we would like a 3rd vampire book. None of which were the option materials I submitted. So there will be a 3rd one, but I sort of conceived of it as a duology. So the process for my 3rd book has been, let's just call it different than my process for my first 2, because I've really had to sort of look at the first 2 book series and be like, well, okay, so what can we do to sort of expand to make it not look like it's just tacked on, but feel like it sort of arises organically from. So it's a bit. I'm in love with like the how it's coming. But at the beginning, I was very much starting from a very different place than I was from the first 2. And then writing process itself, I wish I were somebody who could block off, like, for example, 10 to noon on a Saturday and say, this is what I'm writing, and then sit down and actually write. But I find that I can't train my brain. And maybe this is a futile, maybe nobody can work like this, but sitting down and I say, okay, I have 2 hours to write, that's often like a surefire way to prevent the words from actually coming, which is inconvenient. As I do have, a family and another career. So the thing that I try to do as much as I can is write in my office. I have a home office I'm fortunate enough to have. And something about being in that room, my brain is able to be like, we're writing it. Like there's must be some sort of psychological explanation for that, because that's sort of like the best way to get things going. So yeah, I mean, in terms of actual daily process, location helps me more than I think having a set schedule, which never seems to work.
In addition to writing a book, there's the process of, we'll call, marketing it. And part of that is coming up with titles and the book jackets and things like that. How much input do you have into the process? because both of you, your titles are just amazing. They're right on the money for the books. And I think both of the covers kind of reflect the content too. So is this collaborative or do you just kind of turn it over to the publisher? And we'll start with you, Jenna.
So I've been so fortunate in that my publishers have completely gone with all of my title suggestions. Like it's not been collaborative, which I think is unusual. My second book, I wanted it to be My Fake Date is a Vampire. They did suggest I tweak that somewhat because they thought it would be too samey to My Roommate is a Vampire. But I wouldn't say that that's been collaborative at all. I've been really lucky that they think that my super descriptive titles convey the tone of the books really well. As for the covers, I am not somebody that has good ability to visualize things. My daughter is an artist, and my husband is also very good at visualizing things. I don't have that ability. And so I've been so fortunate to have an amazing cover artist who I give just these I could give this character looks like this, they're about this height, their hair is this color, their build is like this. Here's, the general synopsis of the book. And my artist and the art department at Berkeley has just, I wouldn't have the ability to give input because I just can't do that. And they've just, I think, hit it completely out of the park both times. But if I did have input, they would be receptive to it. I just don't have those skills.
Jamie, what's your process for titles and covers?
Sure, it's a very collaborative effort on both parts. My then editor for my first book is called Fake It Till You Bake It in the series. And that is not the title I submitted it as. She came up with Fake It Till You Bake It. And she's like, what do you think about this? And I was like, I love it. That's so much better than what I came up with. And then A Legend in the Baking, I came up with that title because, again, when I sold the series, I had a title for each book. So we were calling it the second title. And I was like, yeah, it needs to live up to Fake It Till You Bake It. And this title isn't doing that. So, and my editor was like, well, what do you think? Let's, submit some titles. So I just started brainstorming. I came up with a few, which I don't think she liked, which is okay. But I said, eventually I said, well, what about Legend in the Baking? And she was like, I really like that. She went to marketing or whoever at the publishing house, and they really liked it. So we stuck with that. As far as covers, they've been great. For the Legend cover, I knew that I wanted the female lead to surreptitiously be taking his picture because that's kind of their relationship where she's very much trying to do her job and he doesn't really want her to. So I always knew I wanted that. And I submitted pictures of real people who I thought each character looked like. The artist is the same artist as Fake It Till You Bake It. And with Fake It Till You Bake It, the artist was great. I mean, the artist is great for both books, but with the Fake It, the artist came up with a couple different options, and they were just pencil sketches. And I picked the one that I liked the best, so we went with that. And then with Legend, I said I kind of think she should be taking his picture. The artist captured it perfectly. Each character, I can tell the artist actually looked at the pictures that were sent in because they look like the pictures of the celebrities I sent in. So I've been so fortunate. I love both covers and titles, so I can't ask for anything more.
They're wonderful. Both of you now have at least 2 books, if not more, to your credit. What has surprised you as published authors the most about the business of publishing? And you can have more than one answer if you'd like. Jamie?
I've been published, fortunately, since 2014. I think the thing that surprised me the most is, like I said at the beginning, I've been a reader my whole life. And I just kind of assumed that writers. They just wrote books and I loved them and that was it. And, now being on the other side of it, I realize it's a very torturous process. And I mean, it's a fun process, but, wanting to get it right, making sure the story makes sense, that it's interesting, that I'm living up to the promise that I've made to the reader. It's a lot of pressure. So yes, it's fun, but it's really hard. That's the main thing I've learned.
Jenna?
So I agree with everything that Jamie said, but and I've only been published for a year now, a little over a year. And it's possible, actually, it would not surprise me at all if what I'm about to say was not as much a factor when you were a debut. But the extent to which I'm required to have a social media presence and be very active on social media and market, and how much of the marketing plan really revolves around authors doing their own marketing has, I don't know if shocked is a strong enough word. But it's I'm not a visual person. Twitter was great fun. But a lot of the marketing that's expected of authors, even at like big publishing houses, happens on Instagram and TikTok. And it's been an enormous learning curve that I really was not prepared for or expected to have to learn. And so I think the extent to which that's expected and the extent to which that book, the publishing industry expects authors to do their own marketing has really, that's the biggest surprise. And then I think a lot of it also is, and I knew it was an unstable industry. It's why for many decades, I was convinced this wasn't something I could do. But the instability of it now that I'm sort of in it is also very, I think now that I'm in it, it's surprising. I expected it, but it's also surprising, like the extent to which it's true. You see authors talk about, oh, they had, a really great year, but then the next year, maybe they can't sell a book. Like the volatility of it, I think that's the word that I'm looking for, was very surprising.
Let's pivot a little bit and talk about both of you as readers, because you've mentioned that romance was a particular reading passion. What were some of the books that throughout your reading career that kind of inspired you to want to write romances? Jamie?
Oh my goodness. So when I was in elementary school, so very young, in the late 80s, there was a series of teenage romances. They were called Sweet Dreams. And they were very Harlequin-esque, in that they released a few a month, but they were about teenagers. And I loved those so much. And by the time I discovered them, like they'd published at least 100 books at that point. So that meant I had 100 books to catch up on. And the library is a wonderful, wonderful place for that, and there was no such thing as ebooks and internet back then. So it was, buy it hope that your library had a copy of it, actually. So that was the first foray into romance, teen romances. And then my mom's friend, a few years later, my mom was never a reader. So I don't understand why her friend gave her a romance. Like it just sat on her nightstand and taunting me because I read everything at that point. So like eventually I couldn't stand it anymore and I picked it up and I read it and I was like, oh my God, this is so great. They're going to live happily ever after. They're getting married. This is great. And from that point on, I was hooked on romance. I'm sure very soon thereafter, I discovered Nora Roberts and Susan Elizabeth Phillips, who was one of the first, if not the first, to write sports romance. And I was like, well, obviously she was meant for me because I was a big sports fan. And I'm like, she's marrying romance and sports? Yes. So from then on, I've just been a huge reader.
Jenna?
So I also was a huge reader. I came to romance a little bit later. When I was growing up, I mostly read, what did I read? I read a lot of the years are blurring together. I definitely remember Sweet Dreams, but I didn't read those. I think my sister read those series that and loved it. I gosh, this is such a difficult question to answer. I remember being very impacted by the CBC Anne of Green Gables miniseries in the 1980s. I think we might be contemporaries based on some of the answers you've given, and that got me to read the books, which I think were somewhat less about the romance than the show was. But that really like imprinted on me, like in a really, really strong way. The like years of yearning and pining and just such a great flag of a Canadian boy really,
Yes.
I know, like setting the bar for men since like, the early 20th century. And so that was when I was in middle school. And then I read a lot of like fantasy. I read a lot of Stephen King. Like I read sort of a lot of different things, and it wasn't till later in life that I sort of honed in more on, and I read books that I thought were sort of like, this is a serious book. I should be reading this. I read a lot of lit fic. And then as I got older, I actually read more romance as I got older. I discovered Lisa Kleypas. I read everything that she's written. I read a lot of fan fiction, which also, for a bunch of different fandoms, is sort of how, but I'd say, Lisa Kleypas was probably really influential, even though I don't write anything remotely close to what she wrote about, but I really did devour all of those. So rambly answer.
Yeah, it was very interesting, both of your answers, which kind of leads to my next question. As a writer, you can write anything you want. You can write mystery, suspense, fantasy, literary fiction. Why romance? What about it made you think this is what I want to write? And we'll start with you, Jenna.
I feel like the world, and this might sound a little cliche, I feel like the world is just a really hard place. And I want to create something that makes people happy. And that shows people that no matter who you are, no matter what you are, you don't even necessarily have to be human. You can have a happy ending. And I want to write romances that are funny, that, if they read it, it'll give them a few hours of just pure escapism and happy. My day job is very sad. I mean, it's very hard. And a lot of what I do, I work with people that have very sad situations a lot of the time. And so just creating escapism for people is I think just been such a joy.
Jamie?
Yeah, basically what she said. Yes. I love love. I always say that. I've always loved love, even since I was a little kid watching Anne of Green Gables. And so I love the journey they go on, and knowing that, yes, it is going to have a happy ever after at the end. And that's why, basically what Jenna said, what she said, I like writing humor and rom-coms because life is hard. Like, we all know life is hard. We live life. Let's bring some joy, some fun. That's why I write what I write.
We do have a few questions from some of your many fans, so we'll go ahead and insert a few of those. The first one is for Jenna. Someone writes, "Are you as funny in person as you are on the page?"
Yes.
That's amusing.
I mean, I think that my books are maybe funnier because I spend more time kind of making sure the jokes are sort of exactly how I want them to land. But my brother and I have both been told by a lot of people that we're very funny. So
Good. Jamie, someone else has written in to say your books are wonderful about the football players, but have you ever thought about doing another sport?
Oh, of course. Like, I'm a huge sports junkie, period. Like, I watch football, baseball, basketball, hockey. You know, this past 2024, this summer was the best because the Olympics were on. And I was in my happy place for 2 weeks. That's literally what I did every day. I would wake up and turn on the Peacock app because they were in Paris, so they were 6 hours ahead of me. So something was always on. So I've written a basketball book. That's one of my earlier books. And many moons ago, I started a tennis book that I never finished. Maybe one day, probably not. But, I've thought about writing baseball. Yes. So the answer is yes. I do want to write about female athletes. I have not done that yet, but that is definitely on my to-do list.
The next question is for both of you, and this particular reader would like to know, what could you change about publishing if you had the power to change anything in it?
How long do you have? Jamie, do you want to go first?
No, you can go. I'm still thinking. You can go. Yeah, what she said.
So there's a lot of things that I'd like to change. I guess I'd start off by saying I'd like there to be space for more different kinds of voices in mainstream publishing, particularly sort of the big, what they say, the big five or however many they are now after mergers. You frequently see like a lot of similarities in the kinds of books that are like the really, really wildly popular ones. And I don't know, I would like publishing to like take more risks, give more resources, I think, to people that, come from different backgrounds, have different perspectives, a little bit more, maybe a lot more than they currently do. They publish tons and tons of books every year. There's no reason why so many of them necessarily have to all kind of look the same. So that's, I guess, one thing. And then I think I think that I'd love to see publishing devote more actual resources into marketing the books they buy. And again, this is just from the perspective of having first been published a year ago. I don't know what it was like, 10 years ago or more recently than that, but there's definitely, from my brand new perspective, it definitely feels like a sink or swim kind of environment. And I'd love it if publishing could actually commit to putting some like more marketing effort into that. I don't know. How's that?
I think you're actually very much on target, at least from the book selling perspective. I do think there has been, compared to 30 years ago, there's been incremental. Sometimes it seems like small, but some changes to more diversity in the romance genre. I think
That, of
like
course.
30 years,
Yes.
but you can always use more. So I definitely would echo
Exactly.
what you say.
Exactly.
Moving in that direction is a good thing.
Yes.
Marketing, I get the impression that publishing is looking for the one-hit wonders, and when it doesn't pan out, it's thanks, but we're not interested. And the developing a career for a writer is really tough. I mean, I don't know why you two do it, frankly. There's got to be easier ways to earn a living, but
there are actually.
you really have to be committed to writing. It really has to be something you love because it's kind of you progressing your career and making it now. Did you have anything, Jamie?
Yeah, I thought about, and I was like, you mentioned it. I want to see more diversity in publishing. It's really like the way bookstores and box stores choose which books to sell is really frustrating, especially the box stores. They only want the most popular books. And it's like, well, you don't actually give a chance to be popular if you don't carry it. Like it's really frustrating. Yeah. So like, I speak, big box stores, my store is Target, and I just get really frustrated
Mhm.
when I go in and by the cash registers, they have a little end cap of books, and it's supposed to be for people, their last minute, impulse purchases. They do have a book section, but it's all in the back. And I'm like, I don't know if people who aren't bibliophiles like me know that there is a whole book section in the back of the store, and I see, the end cap right by the cash register, and they grab it. And I look at that end cap every single time I'm in Target, and 99% of the time it's white authors. And that's really, really frustrating. And so that's the major thing at this point that I would like to change.
It's really tough, I imagine, for authors because if the book is not there for people to see, they're not going to buy it. And yeah,
Correct.
and I'm
Yeah. And I'll
surprised.
say, yeah, my first book, well, not the first Fake It. So it wasn't Target didn't carry it when it first came out. And then a few months later, I have no idea how they decided which ones, but some Targets started carrying it, which is great. Obviously, I love it. And I would get messages from people like, "Oh, I just saw your book in Target, and the cover was fantastic, so I bought it." And I'm like, "Yes, exactly. They cannot purchase what they do not see and they don't know exists."
That's true. We're almost out of time, but you've mentioned that you're working on projects, and you can say as much or as little as you like, but what can we expect next from you as an author? Jamie?
Well, the third book in my Sugar Blitz series, no release. I'm still working on it, so I'll just be very honest about that. So it's the last football player, and he is the ladies' man of the group, and so watching him fall for someone who isn't interested initially, she's very business oriented, is fun to write and witness. So that's what's next for me.
Jenna?
So my third book is coming out next September or October. The final date hasn't been set yet, but spooky season. And it's called Road Trip with a Vampire. The title
Um,
has been set, and it's about so I'll just say some of the events in the second book end up having spillover effects onto people who only appeared very minimally in the second book. And some of this is a function of turning a 2-book series into a 3-book series. But very, very excited. Characters from the first 2 books will appear, but they're not going to be the primary focus. So, and that's due to my editor on Monday. So,
so we should let you get off the air, but before we go, we did have one other question slip in, and we should probably give this person a moment. They want to know if either of you think in terms of movie rights when you're doing your writing projects. Do you think this would make a great series? Does that even enter the equation when you're writing?
not for me so much. I think partly because I know how hard it is to get books made into movies or TV shows. Yeah, I mean, the thought definitely crosses my mind, and like I'm writing something and I'll be like, oh, this would look great on the screen. But I definitely am writing for an audience that will be reading as opposed to
Vision,
watching. That's just sort of my process.
Jamie?
For me, I was a reader. I was like, I want to be an author. So I wrote a book. That was my idea. I wrote a book. But since Fake It came out, I've actually kind of developed an interest in screenwriting. I've started to dabble in it a little bit. So I do have that thought in the back of my mind now. But when I was first writing the book, no.
Yeah. How can readers learn more about you and your books? Let's do your social media presence. Jamie?
Sure. My website is jamiewesley.com. People love reaching out to me on Instagram. I'm at Jamie Wesley Writes there. Twitter is, where I go to vent. And that is Jamie_Wesley.
Jenna?
So most of my book news is on Jenna Levine Writes on Instagram. I have a newsletter as well. And that's jennalevine.substack.com. I have a Twitter account where I go to like retweet memes, um, and vent also. And that my handle there bears no relation to my author name because I've had it for 100 years, and it's Geno, Jeeno, Namit, Namit. And there was a reason behind that name at one point, and I don't remember what it was because I've really had it for a long time. So
Before we go, I want to let those tuning in virtually know that we've been very honored to have with us today authors Jenna and Jamie. Jenna's new book is out in bookstores and libraries, My Vampire Plus Ones. Makes perfect reading for the spooky Halloween season or any time of the year. Jamie's new book is coming soon, A Legend in the Baking. It will be available in bookstores or libraries. And I'd like to put a pitch into those listening. If you really love an author, pre-order the book. So if you love Jamie's books, go to your local bookstore, request they order it. Go to your local public library and say, why haven't you ordered this series? I'd like to thank both Jamie and Jenna for sharing with us today. And for those of you tuning in virtually, thank you for joining another event with the Poison Pen Bookstore. Okay, and I'm going to try clicking on things. And if I lose both of you, you were terrific as usual. Thank you so much. I'll get this to you and your publicist. It usually takes about a week, but it should be going up on our website as well. Really loved both of your books. Looking forward to the third. Thank you so much.
thank you. And Jamie, it was wonderful meeting you.
Same.
Thank you. I'll do my